What actually consumed the Apple car? Apple controls the most profitable consumer hardware ecosystem ever built, and yet after a decade of effort, it couldn't ship a car. The tech world loves a clean autopsy. Arrogance, margin obsession, or the simplest narrative of all, Tesla was just too fast. But Project Titan didn't die from one mistake. It died because right when it was finally cleared for takeoff, two Black Swans arrived in perfect synchrony, one that sealed the road ahead and another that erased the road behind. And the obvious question is whether robotics can replace it, or whether Apple is simply stepping into something even worse, what is effectively the EV wars over time round. But the real gamble is invisible. When every other tech giant is incinerating capital to fill the black holes of AI compute and unproven hardware, Apple is sitting on $200 billion in reserve, quiet to a degree that feels almost unnatural. And that silence doesn't look like hesitation, it looks like positioning. So the real question isn't why the Apple car failed. It's whether, by retracing this shift from offense to retreat, we can understand if robotics is actually Apple's real future, or whether the cost of this mistake has already become irreversible, or whether Apple is simply waiting for a larger opening. Rewind to 2014, when the window of opportunity wasn't just open, but structurally wide, with no clear dominant model yet locking the industry in place. A consumer electronics giant began searching for an automotive equivalent of Foxconn, not by jumping into production, but by dissecting a century of industry data, mapping a deeply fragmented supply chain, and confronting piece by piece the hard physical constraints of vehicle assembly. What came back was not ambiguity, but a clear structural barrier. No established automaker was willing to collapse into a subordinate OEM role beneath an external intelligence layer, which forced a strategic pivot from outsourcing manufacturing to exploring whether the entire stack, from talent to production, could be rebuilt from the ground up. And while the rest of the industry was scaling, iterating, and competing in real time, Apple spent the next 4 years isolating and validating just two questions. 4 years effectively compressed into a single strategic pause. By 2018, the window hadn't closed, but its edges were becoming visible. Apple moved into execution with a dual-track strategy that, at least on paper, appeared both aggressive and comprehensive. On one side, it pursued partnerships with industrial incumbents like Mercedes-Benz and Volkswagen, attempting to layer autonomous intelligence on top of existing manufacturing systems. On the other, it explored outright acquisitions of brands such as McLaren and BMW, effectively buying its way into the industry. But the partnership track stalled almost immediately, not because of contractual friction, but because of something more fundamental. Control over the cockpit, the layer that defines both intelligence and identity. Legacy automakers were willing to collaborate, but not to concede that layer. The acquisition path, by contrast, was far simpler in structure, requiring no alignment, only capital. And yet, Apple hesitated, possibly attempting to maximize leverage by extending negotiations, applying pressure simultaneously from both directions, and waiting for either valuations or counterparties to weaken. Years later, Huawei would encounter the same constraint, but instead of choosing between partnership and acquisition, it introduced a third path, one that bypassed ownership entirely. By partnering with manufacturers already under transition pressure, it avoided demanding control, while functionally taking over key layers: design, supply chain, marketing, and sales, effectively operating the system without formally owning it. Only after the product proved viable did it return brand ownership, completing the loop, which simultaneously demonstrated that full-stack integration could scale, and that positioning as an enabler rather than a threat could significantly reduce industry resistance. Back to Apple. In 2018, Tesla was still in survival mode, burning cash, struggling through production bottlenecks, and only just sustaining output at around 5,000 vehicles per week. At that scale, relative to global incumbents, it appeared marginal. And from Apple's vantage point, there was no immediate pressure to accelerate. What it didn't recognize was that this moment wasn't static, but transitional. That it had already entered a narrowing 3-year window during which the entire competitive landscape would begin to lock in. And that, just beyond that horizon, two Black Swans were already forming. By 2019, Apple had shifted into a software-first strategy, operating under the assumption that the complexity and friction of manufacturing would only slow its progress toward Level 4 autonomy. To an outside observer, this created a paradox, because if the problem was speed, then capital should have been the simplest solution. Level 4 R&D at roughly $1 to $2 billion per year was effectively negligible when compared to Apple's over $100 billion in annual profit and about $160 billion in cash reserves. But this wasn't a capital constraint. It was a strategic pattern, one repeatedly used by large incumbents when the end game remains uncertain. Instead of funding every possible path, they pay a waiting cost, allowing smaller players to burn capital, explore dead ends, and surface the winning model before committing at scale. The trade-off is structural. It minimizes the risk of betting wrong, but simultaneously increases the probability that someone else scales fast enough to lock the market first. And in 2019, that risk still appeared distant. Tesla's Shanghai factory was only just beginning construction, and the broader EV ecosystem in China had not yet reached full acceleration. Operating under the assumption that time remained on its side, Apple continued to pursue what was effectively a GMS-style model, not just providing the underlying platform, but insisting on controlling the ecosystem layer, user identity, accounts, and the app distribution channel. But this assumption rested on two fragile premises. What if the Foxconn of cars never actually existed? Not as a missing piece, but as a structurally impossible one. What if even a Samsung-style licensing model, where a tech giant provides the platform but surrenders control over accounts and app stores, was still beyond what automakers were willing to concede? If both were true, then the implication was unavoidable. The so-called Tesla model, capital-intensive, vertically integrated, and operationally brutal, was never just one option among many. It was the only viable path from the beginning. But 2 more years passed without that realization, and instead of correcting course, the delay simply compounded the cost of the waiting strategy. By late 2021, had Apple committed to independent manufacturing, accepted low margins in the early phase, and treated the car as a strategic loss leader, it could have scaled just enough to enter the market with credibility by 2024. Not necessarily ahead, but at least close enough to Tesla to still matter. But it didn't. Instead, it remained locked in the same framework. Still searching for Toyota-like partners, still negotiating with Korean suppliers, still attempting to resolve a sovereignty conflict through contractual structures, as if the resistance it faced was a matter of pricing rather than a fundamentally existential boundary. And while Apple followed what appeared to be a perfectly rational, even optimized process, the window didn't gradually close. It snapped shut, not slowly, but violently. Because by then, 2 black swans were no longer distant possibilities. They were already at the door. By 2022, the leaks surrounding the Apple car had begun to change in tone, no longer reading like a project converging toward launch, but rather like one contracting under pressure, with reports, particularly from Bloomberg, pointing to a shift toward a $100,000 vehicle and highway-only autonomy, signals that felt less like a roadmap evolving forward and more like a retreat reframed as iteration. Which raises the central question: what forced Apple into retreat? Because by 2024, the gravity of the industry had already shifted. In the West, Tesla was no longer fighting for the legitimacy of electric vehicles, but instead using its dominance in EVs as a platform to expand into adjacent frontiers, including robotics. In China, meanwhile, BYD had weaponized vertical integration. Huawei's intelligent driving and cockpit ecosystems had begun to solidify, and Xiaomi's SU7 shattered order records almost overnight, collectively demonstrating that even a consumer electronics company could successfully enter the automotive industry, provided it committed to manufacturing from day one. This acceleration wasn't linear, but driven by 2 distinct engines operating in parallel. On one side, Elon Musk's relentless pursuit of efficiency, pushing the US system toward extreme optimization, and on the other, a competition-driven, full-chain iteration cycle in China, compressing time at an industrial scale. What had once been a blue ocean didn't gradually saturate. It flipped into a red ocean, and it did so faster than Apple's internal cadence could absorb or respond to. This was the first black swan, external velocity. The industry didn't just grow, it mutated. And then came the second. November 2022, ChatGPT. 3 months later, Llama. The first generation of AI systems was imperfect, often unreliable, frequently hallucinating, but the strategic signal they sent was unmistakable. For the company that once displaced Nokia, this wasn't just another technological wave, but a direct threat to the foundation of its dominance. Because AI didn't sit on top of the existing paradigm, it bypassed it, acting as a potential dagger aimed directly at the GUI-based App Store model that underpinned the iPhone. Had Apple accelerated years earlier, it might have avoided this position entirely. Instead, it now found itself caught in a pincer movement. unable to fully enter a new industry while simultaneously being forced to defend its existing one, which left only one viable move. Apple began to unwind the Titan project, reallocating resources to reinforce its core, while shifting into observation mode, watching and waiting for the emergence of the next dominant hardware form in the AI era. Whether that would take the form of embodied robotics or another all-in moment not yet visible remained an open question. After Titan was terminated, the question simplified rather than expanded. What is Apple actually doing now, and why does it appear so unusually quiet compared to the rest of Silicon Valley's accelerating AI frenzy? The answer is not inactivity, but containment. Apple is attempting to pull the AI war inside its own walls, because in an AI-first world, its only defensible position is to make AI subordinate to iOS, rather than allowing iOS to become subordinate to AI. This is where the Apple M4 series becomes strategically relevant. In 2024, Apple made a rare cross-generational leap, pushing its neural engine to 38 TOPS, not because users suddenly demanded that level of performance, but because Apple was deliberately over-provisioning hardware capacity, ensuring that on-device generative AI could become the default interaction layer before cloud-based AI had the chance to establish itself as the primary gateway. At the same time, Apple has been expanding its data center footprint across regions such as North Carolina, Oregon, and Arizona, reflecting a deeper recognition that in the AI era, compute is no longer just a cost variable, but a form of sovereignty. And outsourcing that sovereignty is functionally equivalent to leasing your own future from a competitor. Apple's vulnerability, however, is structurally unique. It cannot dominate frontier AI research in the way OpenAI or Google can. It does not possess the logistics and infrastructure fortress of Amazon, and it cannot afford to become dependent on cloud providers that are structurally incentivized to displace it. The perceived alignment between Google and Apple is, in this context, increasingly superficial. While both benefited from the mobile era, Google has spent over a decade watching Apple capture the majority of industry profits, leaving Android as a highly efficient distribution system with steadily eroding monetization power. Which is why Google's strategic objective is no longer to defend Android as an operating system. Instead, it is attempting to dissolve the operating system layer altogether by elevating AI into the primary interface. Because once AI becomes the entry point, the OS fades into invisibility, and control over AI becomes control over distribution itself, and the pressure doesn't end there. Amazon is simultaneously leveraging its dominance in data center infrastructure to move up the stack into AI, meaning that if Apple fails to secure compute independence, it could eventually be forced to run its own intelligence layer on infrastructure owned by a competitor, with every incentive to extract value from that dependency, which leaves Apple with a singular strategic objective: to defend the final interface. Apple's vision is for AI to dissolve into the operating system, becoming an invisible layer, much like the browser, while AI-native companies are pursuing the inverse, attempting to elevate AI into the primary gateway and push the operating system into the background, a dynamic that increasingly resembles a new browser wars moment, but with far higher stakes. And at this point, Apple is no longer outside the blast radius. It is standing directly inside it. With cars abandoned, the obvious speculation is robotics, because beyond robotics, Apple has very few remaining candidates for a new growth device. And the smartphone era is mature enough that incremental upgrades cannot sustain the narrative forever. But robotics sounds visionary precisely because people haven't done the math. Apple's car interest surfaced around 2010 and ended in 2024, which means it spent roughly 14 years circling an industry before finally retreating. And robotics follows an eerily similar curve. Optimistic forecasts suggest perhaps 10 million units by 2035, while the true total war phase might not arrive until 2040. So if Apple enters robotics today, it is not entering a market that will explode next year. It is entering a market that will punish patience. And when we look at the EV industry's 15-year evolution, Apple's retreat from cars actually appears correct, because automotive has devolved into a total form war, where every successful commercial archetype in business history has been replayed, optimized, and weaponized. BYD resembles early Toyota, but pushed further, combining broad product coverage with deep vertical integration and infrastructure ambitions, aiming for charging density as ubiquitous as gas stations. Huawei resembles Microsoft and Google, but goes deeper, providing not just the intelligent OS layer, but also hardware foundations like motors, while relying on partners' volume to sustain its ecosystem margins. Xiaomi resembles the early iPhone playbook, using a blockbuster strategy to crush costs, dominate youth demographics through design, and convert driving pleasure into cultural identity, and crucially, it bypassed Apple's biggest mistake by building its own factory from day one. Tesla remains the purest archetype: full control, full vertical integration, full obsession with experience. In this landscape, even incumbents struggle for margins, and latecomers don't even get soup. Now transfer this logic to robotics, and the situation becomes even grimmer, because robotics shares the same DNA: propulsion, energy system, sensors, autonomy. And therefore EV giants can pivot with industrial mass already built, meaning robotics is not a fresh battlefield. It is the overtime round of the EV war. The revenue math is brutal. EV production was under 3 million in 2020 and may exceed 50 million by 2035, while robotics in 15 years might only reach 11 million units even under aggressive forecasts, less than 20% of the automotive sector's revenue potential. And the worst part is timing. Entering EVs in 2014 meant facing proto-Tesla, but entering robotics today means facing a fully weaponized Tesla plus an entire phalanx of EV giants ready to pivot. So robotics is not Apple's easy redemption arc, it is arguably an even harsher arena than cars. So, does Apple still have a chance? Yes, but not where most people are looking. Apple's true opening is not in the physical chassis of a car or a robot, it lies in the evolution of AI itself. Because what we call AI today is likely just the faster carriage phase before the internal combustion engine arrives. If that is true, then the companies spending hundreds of billions today might be building infrastructure for a paradigm that will be obsolete, while Apple's restraint could become its most dangerous weapon. Because Apple still has the war chest, it still has the cash flow, it still has the 2 billion device moat, and most importantly, it still has distribution, at least for now. Apple's greatest asset is not speed, it is optionality, late mover power,